Chapter 17. Elizabeth. Elizabeth couldn't help smiling as she dressed the next morning. Not only would today be her first official day at her store, but she'd had such a pleasant night with Carl last night that everything felt like it was falling into place. She could still feel the gentle touch of his lips on hers, and though she hadn't invited him to share the bed, she'd been close. It was simply a matter of time now. She opened the bedroom door quietly in case he was still sleeping, but the couch was empty. The coffee was on the stove, though, so she knew he was up. Had he started his chores already? The thought made her a little sad. She'd been looking forward to seeing him this morning and maybe receiving another kiss. But he wouldn't start chores without breakfast, would he? Surely not. Yesterday he hadn't had help, but he couldn't be that far behind, could he? She glanced around for any sign that he'd already eaten, but other than the freshly made coffee, there was nothing. So where was he? It didn't matter. She would warm up the bread and have breakfast ready for him when he came in. The door opened a few minutes later, and he stepped in, smiling softly at her.
"Good morning. I trust you slept well."
"I did, thank you." He nodded, closed the door behind him, and crossed the room to where she was standing. As he stepped closer to her to grab the coffee urn, a shiver of delight raced down her spine. There was such a masculine energy radiating from him that she longed for him to hold her in his arms again.
"I saddled a horse for you today, as I figure you'll be wanting to go into town again," he said.
"Oh, thank you." Elizabeth was surprised. Not that he had saddled up the horse, but that he'd done it first thing without her having to ask. "I was hoping to head there after breakfast, but I should be back earlier today to work in the garden as well."
"Very good."
He smiled at her and then leaned in and placed a quick kiss on her lips. It was over too quickly, but Elizabeth knew he had work to do. Longer kisses were probably saved for free time in the evening. They sat down for breakfast, and then after she'd cleaned up, Elizabeth put together a lunch, gathered some material to work on a dress at the store, and headed out to the barn. A chestnut mare was tied to the post outside, and Carl was waiting to help her mount up.
"Have you ridden before?"
he asked as he untied the mare. "I have. It's been a few years, but I think I remember." Riding lessons had been one of the few things her father had splurged on for her as a child. There were still a lot of people who owned horses in Chicago, though many in the city had given them up due to the recent addition of streetcars, something Elizabeth doubted would show up in Sage Creek for a while yet.
"Good to know. This here is Brownie. She's a good girl, so you shouldn't have any issues with her."
Elizabeth nodded, and before placing her foot in the stirrup, she put her fabric and lunch into the saddlebag to free up her hands, then grabbed her dress and swung up onto the saddle.
"You remember how to get to town?"
Carl asked. Elizabeth replayed the trips in her head. She felt confident she could find her way. "I think so. I'll be fine."
"Okay, just stay on this path and watch yourself in the high brush."
He didn't say it, but Elizabeth remembered the brush they had to pass through just before reaching the town. It was tall enough and thick enough for someone to hide in, and the thought gave her pause. Was he worried about someone attacking her? Surely not. He was probably just being cautious. After all, she was a woman, unfamiliar with the area, traveling alone. But she would keep her guard up. She always did. "I will."
"Have fun, then."
Elizabeth flicked the reins to get the horse moving, and soon the homestead was just a speck behind her. The first part of the trip was quiet and peaceful. Elizabeth lifted her face as the warm sun beat down, spreading warmth and life. But as she entered the brush, the mood changed. A chill crept up Elizabeth's back. She glanced around, but she could see no one hiding in the brush. Could they be completely camouflaged? Flicking the reins, she urged the horse to go a little faster, but only when she reached the general store did her discomfort lessen. The feeling of eyes watching her lingered, but there were people milling about the town that made her feel safer. She tied up the mare, grabbed her items, and hurried into the store. "Good morning, Mr. Brown," she called as she entered. He looked up from the shelf he was stocking.
"Good morning. I didn't expect you this early, but I placed your dress in the window. Come tell me how it looks."
Though she had seen the dress when she arrived, she followed him to the display. "It looks amazing. Thank you for doing this." He rubbed his chin as he surveyed his work.
"You're right. It does look amazing, and I'm sure it will draw customers in."
She smiled. "I hope so, but now that one of my dresses is unavailable to wear for a time, I need to make a new one. However, please let me know if I can help you in any way."
"Thank you, I will."
As he returned to stocking the shelves, she made her way upstairs. But when she reached the top, she realized she still had no table or chair. So after dropping her bag, she returned downstairs to see what she could scrounge up. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Brown, but do you have an extra chair and a small table that I can use upstairs?" Mr. Brown paused his stocking to look around the store.
"I'm afraid I don't have a table, but there is a chair in the back room that you could use."
"Thank you." She followed Mr. Brown's directions to the back room. It was small and clearly held his extra supplies, so it took her a few minutes to find the chair he was talking about. After moving the supplies covering it, she took the chair upstairs and then pulled out her fabric. A few hours later, she heard footsteps on the stairs. She glanced up to see the dark-haired woman from yesterday, Rebecca something or other. "Hello, are you looking for a dress?" "Maybe, but I'm more curious about you. Mr. Brown says you're new to town." She smiled, but there was something off about it, as if it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I am. I came out here from Chicago." "Oh, do you have family here?" Heat climbed Elizabeth's neck. "Well, I have married Carl Baxter. He is my family now, but before that, no. My family all lived in Chicago, but sadly they've all passed away." Rebecca's face folded in what Elizabeth assumed she thought was compassion, though it came off more like mock sympathy. "Oh, you poor dear. Maybe that's why Emma didn't tell you. At least, I assume she didn't." Though Elizabeth was sure she didn't want to hear whatever Rebecca was about to say, she also couldn't help but ask, "Tell me what?" Rebecca glanced down at the general store area and lowered her voice. "I'm not sure I should say anything. It's probably not my place." No, it probably wasn't. But now Elizabeth had to know. If it concerned her, she needed to know, right? "If it involves me, then I should hear it." A mischievous glint sparkled in Rebecca's eyes. "Well, it involves you in a roundabout way. But if I were you, I would want to know that my husband had courted and proposed to Mrs. Emma Cook, before she married William Cook, that is." "What?" Elizabeth felt like she had been punched in the stomach. "That can't be true." "Oh, but it is." Now that she'd piqued Elizabeth's curiosity, Rebecca leaned closer as if sharing a scandalous secret. They were childhood friends, and he proposed to her before she met her first husband, Joseph. She said no, but he proposed again when Joseph was killed. Then, when she began courting William, he found out that William had been the man in charge of getting Joseph killed, and they had a big argument about it. "Why are you telling me this?" Elizabeth asked. Rebecca shrugged and leaned back, once again looking as if she couldn't care less. "Because I would want to know what kind of man I married, and if there were ulterior motives behind Emma's help. After all, Carl clearly loved Emma. Perhaps he still does." Could that be true? Elizabeth thought back to the encounters with Emma. Carl hadn't seemed like he was in love with the woman, but there had been a few instances where they'd exchanged glances as if sharing an unspoken message. Could he still have feelings for Emma? If so, why would he bring her here? Was it an attempt to make Emma jealous, or simply in hopes that he would get over her? And what did that mean for Elizabeth? He'd been so kind and gentle towards her, and they'd kissed. In fact, she had been close to inviting him to share the bed with her last night. She supposed she was glad that she hadn't now. She looked back at Rebecca. Emma and the other women had told her that Rebecca had been unkind to Kate at first, but that had been because of Pauline. And Emma had said that kindness was something Rebecca struggled with. But knowing what she did now, could she trust Emma's words? Why would Rebecca want to hurt Elizabeth? Although maybe it wasn't Elizabeth. Maybe she wanted to hurt Emma or Carl. But could Rebecca be right? Could Carl still love Emma? The thought made Elizabeth sick to her stomach, but she knew she'd have to find out the truth. Well, thank you for telling me. I think you're wrong, though. I've seen Carl and Emma interact, and they don't seem like they're in love. A small, smug grin tugged at Rebecca's lips. Think what you want. I just know I wouldn't put up with it if it was me. But then again, I guess you have nowhere else to go, so maybe you have to. Anyway, I'd keep an eye open if I were you. And then before Elizabeth could ask if Rebecca needed a dress, or if she'd just come to gossip, the girl turned around and left, leaving Elizabeth confused and bewildered. Was Rebecca telling the truth or trying to stir the pot? Unless the woman was like this with everyone, the latter made little sense. Rebecca didn't know Elizabeth and couldn't guarantee she would go sharing the news, so her words being the truth made far more sense. Unfortunately, it raised even more questions. If it was the truth, why hadn't Carl or Emma told her? She supposed she could understand Emma not saying anything, as it sounded like Carl had been the one with feelings that Emma hadn't reciprocated. But why would Carl introduce her to Emma knowing they had a history? And why would he not disclose that history? He had to know she would find out sooner or later. Deciding she wouldn't feel better until she found out, Elizabeth laid down the dress she'd been working on and went in search of Emma. Though she'd never been to the clinic, Elizabeth found it easily thanks to Mr. Brown's directions. She knocked lightly on the door and pushed it open when Emma smiled and waved from inside. Elizabeth, so good to see you. Have you had lunch? I was just about to eat and would love for you to join me. In the wake of Rebecca's visit, Elizabeth had forgotten all about eating. I left my food back at the store. I really just came to ask you a question. Emma's brow wrinkled slightly, but she nodded. Okay, what is it? Did you and Carl court? The color drained from Emma's face and her smile faded. Who told you that? Rebecca. She just left the general store. Is it true? Emma sighed. It is, but it's not what you think, Elizabeth. Carl and I grew up together, and as you can tell, there aren't a lot of women in this town. Carl thought we belonged together, and we were good friends, so we did court for a time, but I didn't feel the way he did. Then Joseph entered my life, and I fell for him. But Rebecca said he proposed again just months ago. She claims that you're still in love, or at least that Carl is still in love with you. Emma shook her head. Rebecca is a hurting woman who doesn't always think before she speaks. Carl is no longer in love with me, if he ever was. I think because we grew up together, he thought we would be good as husband and wife, but we wouldn't have been. Maybe it took Carl a little longer to accept that, but he did. So Rebecca not only spoke out of turn, but I'm afraid she didn't speak the whole truth. Elizabeth chewed the inside of her lip. She wanted to believe Emma, but how could she really be sure that Carl didn't still love her? What if putting out the ad had been a desperate attempt from Carl to get over Emma? I hear what you're saying, but how do I trust that Carl is no longer in love with you? Emma smiled softly. The best way I can think of is to ask him. A good marriage is built on communication. Elizabeth supposed that was true. But could she trust Carl to tell her the truth? There was only one way to find out.